China's sharp power, Beijing's growing repression in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and around the world. Good afternoon and welcome to Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs here in Miami, and this webinar series brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow in the Václav Havel Program on Human Rights and Diplomacy and Director of the European Eurasian Studies Program at the Green School at FIU, and I'll serve as your moderator for today. Last month's decision by Chinese authorities to impose a stringent national security law in Hong Kong triggered a highly critical reaction from the international community. That decision comes on top of the Communist Party's massive and ongoing repression of the Uighur ethnic minority, as well as increasing muscle flexing in the South China Sea and with a number of China's neighbors, to include skirmishes along the Sino-Indian border and rising tensions with Nepal and Bhutan. At the same time, the relationship with the United States is rapidly deteriorating over the coronavirus pandemic, trade disputes, human rights, allegations of spying and cyber attacks, Huawei, and among many other matters. Beijing's sharp power seems to be getting even sharper. Where do we go from here? We have a terrific panel to put all of this in perspective. Thomas Breslin is professor in the Politics and International Relations Department at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School. Manuel Gomez is Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Global Engagement here at FIU. And last but not least, Chris Walker, joining us from Washington, D.C., is Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. Thanks to all three of you for joining us here today. And we're going to start with a few opening comments from each of our panelists. And I think, Tom, we'll turn to you first.
Thank you, David. And I'm very happy to be here, and this is a distinguished panel. So it's always a joy to meet my colleagues and discuss very important affairs with them. And this indeed is a major issue. What does an emergent and aggressive China mean for international affairs and indeed for the people who live under China's rule? I want to frame this as a historian in a very, very large framework that over the time, the thousands of years that the Han Chinese have been moving southward and westward, expanding their domain, they have repeatedly assimilated or tried to assimilate the people whom they've been dealing with. And I think Hong Kong is just one instance of this issue of expansion and attempted assimilation. Sometimes, however, overextension has occurred. And sometimes within that number set, if you want, catastrophe has ensued for the central government. As a result of that, China has been, for half its history, united and half its history fractured and broken up. And there's been a tremendous drive to recapture parts of the old territory, things thought to have been lost to the Chinese. And when the Chinese do take over, an effort is always made to assimilate, homogenize, if you want, the people under central government rule. Just focusing on the period after World War II, for one example, the nationalist government, before it fell to the communists, tried and took over the Eastern Turkestan Republic and fastened Chinese rule upon it. When the communists took over, they continued to hold this Central Asian area inhabited by Turkish people and Kazakhs, Muslims, all of them. In 1950, almost immediately after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Chinese People's Liberation Army took over Tibet. And for about 10 years, there was more or less an era of bad feelings. But in the 60s, that became an era of guerrilla warfare and culminated in the flight of the Dalai Lama to India. The 1960s were a time of the great proletarian cultural revolution, when the Chinese, led by Mao Zedong, tried to purge everything foreign from religion, culture, music, literature, and so forth from China, and to have China basically homogenized around a northern Chinese vision of what it what you should be if you were to be Chinese. Of course, that ended when Mao died. Deng Xiaoping took over, opened up China. We're all pretty much aware of what happened then. Foreign money came in, China began to industrialize. But within a very short period of time, Deng Xiaoping launched a campaign to purge Western bourgeois values from China. So we have these periods of opening up followed by periods of repression. And that becomes a hallmark of the Beijing government's style, if you want, in managing affairs within China. In 1989, following a lot of protest in the various cities by young people and civil servants, there was a culmination in the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. The Tiananmen protesters were very much supported by the people of Hong Kong. This was before Great Britain decided to turn Hong Kong back over to the Beijing government, which it did in the 1990s, with a promise from Beijing that the Hong Kong people and their government would be semi-autonomous, have their own legal system. So that was 1997. By 2001, the Chinese of Hong Kong were worried very much that academic freedom was perishing in Hong Kong, made headlines in, for example, the Chronicle of Higher Education. In 2003, 500,000 Hong Kongers went into the streets to protest against the Hong Kong government's efforts to curtail democracy there. And the same thing happened on a smaller scale. 200,000 people in 2011 went into the streets and protested against efforts to cut down democracy as it was starting to emerge from the grassroots in Hong Kong. We had the same thing happen in the umbrella protests in 2014, when young Hong Kongers went out into the streets using umbrellas to ward off the pepper spray from the police, and for 79 days protested in favor of democracy and against anti-democratic legislation in Hong Kong. So what's happening in Hong Kong is one example of this effort by the Chinese government to assimilate, basically to integrate, to turn its back on promises to let the Hong Kongers be different in their government. But this is something that happened in Tibet. It's something that happened in Xinjiang. And from time to time, across the span of Chinese history, this has resulted in overreach and a catastrophic end for the government in power at the center of Chinese politics. So what's happening in Hong Kong potentially could have some very far-reaching effects in the central government. Don't want to exaggerate that. We're looking at a very long span of history. But in fact, the Chinese government is not behaving very much different from prior Chinese dynasties, and oftentimes with very bad effect for politics and government and the people of China in general. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over for a more finely detailed treatment of this very important set of instances. And this is but one instance of many, many efforts by the Chinese government to expand its borders and its political clout internationally. But since it's at such a tender juncture, it perhaps could be more important than some of the others.
Thanks very much. That was a great scene setter, I think, for us to get started. Manuel, let me turn it over to you to take a more detailed look at what's happened in Hong Kong with the legislation. Thanks.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Tom, for your wonderful presentation. So I will refer to obviously from the legal standpoint to two levels that I think are very important when analyzing this situation. One is the international law level, which is what has made news, and then the other one is a national, or as lawyers like to say, the domestic law level. And I will make a specific reference to the United States which is also has made some headlines in the news outlets. So on June 30th, the Chinese government passed a law. The National People's Congress of China passed a 66 article law, which title is A Law on Safeguarding National Security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. The designation of a special administrative region is unique in the sense that it has allowed Hong Kong since 1997, since the passage of Hong Kong from British control over to China, to have a special status that allows countries such as the United States to give Hong Kong a special treatment, given that Hong Kong was such, or has been such, an important trade partner to the United States, while recognizing at the same time that Hong Kong is not a sovereign state. So it is, Hong Kong is not the only territory in the world that is in that situation. It's certainly not the only territory of China that is in that situation like that, that has put other states in an interesting position of recognizing that trade is so important, but at the same time, creating some ambiguous international law status for Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, vis-a-vis China, is a special administrative region, which means that it holds a large degree of autonomy, but at the same time, China recognizes it as part of its territory. The policy towards Hong Kong has been labeled as a one country, two systems policy. Interestingly enough, the treaty that gave birth to that special status of Hong Kong is a bilateral treaty signed between the Chinese government and the British government in 1984. It entered into effect in 1985. It's a bilateral treaty that the parties have, when they signed the treaty, they deposited with the United Nations. There was no doubt that this was an enforceable piece of law, but over time, the British have continued to say this is a binding treaty. The treaty is a contract between states, and China has stepped back from that characterization of this is a binding international agreement. And gradually has said, well, that's a historical document. It's not binding. There's no enforcement mechanism, and so on and so forth. So the 1984 Sino-British, the joint declaration, which is how it's known, gave Hong Kong a great deal of autonomy. Gave Hong Kong freedoms recognized under important international treaties. And in a couple of minutes, when I go back to the national security law that was just passed, interestingly, that law mentions those international treaties. It mentions, even though some people have said from a rhetorical standpoint, basically, but it mentions the fact that those international regimes are important in the life of Hong Kong, at least, on paper. So the Sino-British Joint Declaration gave Hong Kong certain degree of autonomy. The United States, in preparation for the handover of Hong Kong to China, also passed legislation that would allow the United States to continue trading with Hong Kong, that gave Hong Kong special status. You've seen in the news that the president has said is going to revoke the special status of Hong Kong. I'll refer to that in a minute. So basically, what the US did is that it passed a law, a US law, known as the US Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992, that basically treated Hong Kong as a non-sovereign entity, distinct from China for purposes of US domestic law, based on the principles of that bilateral treaty, the joint declaration that I referred to a minute ago. And it basically gave the United States some wiggle room to be able to continue doing business with Hong Kong, while at the same time continue having a relationship with China, which has been, rocky lately, but then at the time was a good compromise situation, although not very, not ideal from the international law standpoint. More recently, in November of 2019, given the decline of the political situation in Hong Kong and the civil liberties and so on and so forth, U.S. Congress passed an amendment to the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992, and that amendment is known as the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019. One of the big changes, or the big changes of these that this amendment brings, is that it includes provisions regarding the Secretary of State's certification of the legal status of Hong Kong. So basically, it puts in the hand of the executive of the Secretary of State the authority to determine whether Hong Kong continues to deserve the certification of a special legal status, and there are all these trade implications and so on and so forth. So just to end my brief comment, going back to the Chinese law, to the Hong Kong security law, as I said earlier, it talks about the one country, two systems policy under which the people of Hong Kong administer Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy. Actually, Article 1 of the law reasserts that. It says the Chinese Congress recognizes that Hong Kong deserves a high degree of autonomy. In Article 4 talks about human rights, talks about the provisions of the International Covenant of Civil Rights, Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which are widespread, well-known international treaties that actually were part of the basis of the joint declaration. But then it talks about the need to prevent, suppress, and punish offenses that endangered national security under the umbrella of some rule of law protection. It gives the Hong Kong government bodies the function, or it delegates the function to enforce laws, to take measures to strengthen the enforcement of the national security law. It promotes national security education in schools and universities. It's Article 10. So it creates an obligation for the Hong Kong government to devise programs that are going to be taught in school on national security. It holds the chief executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region accountable to the people's government, to the central people's government in China. It establishes a government. It creates 4 crimes: secession, Article 20, subversion, Article 22, terrorist activities, which is very similar to a lot of laws that you would find in different parts of the world, Article 24, and collusion with a foreign country or with external elements to endanger national security. Then it also has a provision on deportation of foreign or non-residents who are found to be conspiring against the stability of China, not only Hong Kong. So just to end, there are 3 points that have caused alarm in the world about this new law. The first one is that it is the first successful attempt, although not the first attempt, but the first successful so far, attempt by the PRC to establish a national security agency in Hong Kong. This hadn't happened before. There had been attempts before. In 2003, there had been an attempt to pass a law. Massive protests ensued, so it was not happening. Number 2, Article 38 of the law creates a notion similar to that of universal jurisdiction, which basically allows Chinese authorities to prosecute anyone, anywhere, who is found or who is suspected of having committed an offense against the law. So someone who is in a foreign territory with a foreign national could be prosecuted for crimes against that law. that's going to be very, very controversial. It's very broad the way how it's, and the last point is that serious cases might be tried in mainland courts in China. Those of you who've been following the developments of Hong Kong and China must remember that one of the big controversies from last year was that that possibility of extraditing people charged of having committed a crime in Hong Kong to mainland China, and that's what caused a lot of the protests. This is a different twist of the same thing. So it basically gives those sweeping powers to the Chinese judiciary to try and convict someone. It is full of language of modern laws. It talks about rights. It talks about human rights. Actually, it talks about respect for international law. It has the appearance of a law that is attuned with the institutional stability of the 21st century, although we know from looking at other countries and even at China itself, that one thing is the law in the books, the other one might be the law in action. I'm gonna stop here.
And well, thanks so much. A great look at what the legislation, the law means and the implications of it. Chris, let me turn to you now.
So David, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank you and your colleagues for the invitation to join this discussion. And I thought what I would do, building on the presentations of Professors Breslin and Gomez, is to widen the lens a little bit. And I think the two of them have touched on the way in which the Chinese authorities use what some call rule by law to achieve their ends. This is an evidence in the case of Hong Kong. In the case of the Xinjiang region, we're seeing what is effectively a modern version of the Gulag, where hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Uyghurs are being put into camps, incredibly, in the 21st century. And so that's kind of the framing in the context of these examples that the other speakers touched on. But I think what's so important for us to recognize is that in recent years, as the Beijing authorities have tightened their grip on Chinese society, and today even more so in the case of Hong Kong, they've also, as a much more internationally assertive power, started to express their preferences and efforts at control beyond their borders. And I think part of the reason we've underestimated this is because the dominant assumptions that we all had coming out of the Cold War were that we would engage with China in economic terms, and that we would invite them into international institutions of various sorts, including but not limited to the WTO, and that over time, gradually, China would liberalize and the authorities there would start to release their grip on Chinese society. And to the extent that may have been happening a little bit, say, in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008, it certainly has changed dramatically since that time, and even more so since Xi Jinping has assumed power there. And as China has become a global power, this, of course, has implications for all of us. So I would say that for too long in free societies, we have viewed trends within China as separate from developments within the PRC. And I think this is something we're only starting to come to terms with. A critical aspect of China's development is the extensive resources, just to give an example of how this is impacting us in the sphere of modern technology. And this is quite relevant to the discussion of the Xinjiang autonomous region, where now so much of the control is exercised through modern technology. The reason I emphasize this case is because, in essence, a good deal of the efforts at control in Xinjiang are being road tested for use beyond that region. And in fact, they're being road tested and incubated for purposes internationally, as far afield as places like Africa and Latin America. And I think this is also something that we're only starting to come to grips with. In an environment without meaningful checks on state powers, the Chinese authorities have wide latitude for testing an ever more elaborate set of methods of censorship and social management. As powerful technologies exert even greater influence, the US and other democracies are engaged in complex and difficult debates that involve civil society, government, and academia over issues regarding privacy, surveillance, and security. Such debates, for all practical purposes, don't occur in China, and this opens up enormous space for systematic abuse of the kind we're seeing. I'd note that as machine learning and other technological advances accelerate, as they extend beyond Xinjiang, the precision with which the Chinese government will be able to modernize censorship is bound to grow. And so, as I noted, the Uighur region is in effect serving as an incubator for the testing and development of cutting-edge technologies that are used as tools of repression. I'd also like to mention that just today we've released a report at the International Forum for Democratic Studies that's titled Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Norms. It's authored by Nicholas Wright, and it really gets into the heart of the discussion on why it's so important to have democratic accountability and democratic norms around emerging technologies. If we don't do this from open democratic societies, that space will be filled by countries and the governments of countries like China, as is already happening. And I'd be glad to talk a little bit more about that. And I would commend people who are watching now to this new report of ours. So finally, I'd also just like to say a few words apart from the technological sphere. And I'd also stress this, especially as we're discussing this in a university context, that Beijing over these last years, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, has refined and scaled up its instruments of influence, and with them, its ability to manipulate the political landscape in other countries. As leadership in Beijing has become more repressive domestically, it's become even more ambitious internationally in ways that are in opposition to democratic values and the rule of law. We're seeing a whiff of this in Hong Kong. We're seeing versions of this that are being tested farther afield in other parts of the world. It's important to note that under the direction of the CCP, China has established platforms abroad for educational, cultural, and other forms of influence within open societies. Over time, it's become clearer that these kinds of initiatives tend to be, and I'll quote from a report that we released in 2017, accompanied by an authoritarian determination to monopolize ideas, suppress alternative narratives, and exploit partner institutions in what is now understood by many as sharp power. So this comes in a variety of different shapes. One way is through leveraging economic power. Some call this corrosive capital. This is very poorly understood, but I would just use the shorthand description to say that so much of the investment that comes from what are often seen as nominally autonomous Chinese state firms have very serious non-economic costs. In the technology sphere, this might be seen as systems that have the capacity and affordances for censorship that are baked in. These have a price. I'm happy to talk more about that later. And I'd also conclude with stressing the media and information sphere, which is so important. And I just note this, that sometimes we think of China's outward engagement simply as being like the BBC or AFP or such international broadcasters, but China's outward-facing information engagement is multidimensional. It includes engagement of audiences through direct state media presence. This includes entities like Xinhua and China Global Television Network. It includes Chinese state media entering into partnership agreements directly with local media outlets, including placing paid supplementary materials into local media, content sharing agreements, and content co-production. This is happening globally. It's happening throughout Latin America, which is, I think, of particular interest for this audience, in countries as far afield as Argentina, Chile, and elsewhere. And so I might just conclude by saying so much of the outward-facing engagement by China that they're now using to exert influence is happening in the non-kinetic realm. It's happening in the space that was typically and customarily understood to be the soft power realm. And so much of the response that's critical in this new environment will have to come from the non-governmental sector. It will need to come from leadership at universities, leadership at cultural institutions, editors and media owners in open societies who will have to reset their own standards to defend free expression, to defend the integrity of their institutions in complementary efforts with government and official institutions. But this will not happen through government engagement on its own. It's going to happen through what we call a full spectrum response to this challenge. In the absence of that, we'll continue to be fighting an uphill battle. And with that, I'm going to leave it to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Chris, thank you very much. Terrific presentations, all three of you. And let me let our viewers know, I assume none of you is doing this for the first time on Zoom. You know there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to send in any questions you have, and I'll do my best to get to them. We already received 2 questions before this panel started, and I'll get to those as well. But let me start with you, Tom, first, if I can, and ask you, as you look at what President Xi is doing, he's eliminated term limits, so he could potentially be president for life. This crackdown we're seeing not just in Hong Kong, as you described. Is he operating out of a sense of strength or out of a sense of concern and weakness about what's happening, would you say?
Well, I can't read his mind, but I think he's testing the boundaries, if you want. He, remember, began with a vigorous anti-corruption campaign, and that basically is still a questionable one in terms of, was it really anti-corruption or was it a partisan, a factional campaign against his enemies? And I don't think we have an absolutely clear answer to that, even to this day. I think that one of the things that a system as centralized as China has to be wary of is having decisions at the center cascade down through the system so forcefully that the people who are agents of that system on the frontiers, whether they be military frontiers or propaganda frontiers or whatever, carry out, if you want, whatever they perceive their mission to be. And I think basically China has become very, very overextended. And I think that Xi is conscious of that. For example, Pakistan was promised multiple billions of dollars, but the Chinese have not been able to carry through with all of their promises to Pakistan. Money runs short, and the distribution of the money within Pakistan is a political matter in Pakistan, as the Balukis, for example, are not happy with where the central government has decided to run the Chinese pipelines and transportation lines across Pakistan from China to the Indian Ocean. So so I think there's been overpromising that's been done by Xi and his cohort in that regard. I think they have basically muscled too many people in the maritime area around China, Japan around the Senkaku. So what's happened? Japan has begun changing its strategy from a defense strategy to an offensive defense strategy, basically building aircraft carriers now and buying American vertical takeoff jets. So Japan suddenly has adopted a whole new anti-Chinese strategy that's able to inflict a great deal of pain on China if its interests are threatened. Vietnam has been buying submarines from Russia to counter the pressures of China in the South China Sea. Indonesia has begun to bulk up its maritime forces in order to push back. India, the same thing. And we've seen recently this confrontation along the border as a result of Indian building up a transportation network to the line of control between the two countries. We have a border that's not settled, even though China has established something called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to mediate problems among its members, which include India and Pakistan. So I think Xi has overextended in many ways, and I think he's acting out of weakness. The pushback has not only been military. In the United States, the Confucius Institutes have been invited to go away or just sent away. In Australia and New Zealand, there's been tremendous pushback against Chinese influence. And I think part of this is due to a weakness in the American political character. You'll recall that in the 1980s, there was a panic that swept through many political circles about Japan in the United States. Japan was number one. Japan was going to sweep all things before it. Well, China has followed Japan's model in many ways. And it remains to be seen if the Chinese economy is a bubble, right? Or will run into a stagnation given all its local indebtedness that Japan ran into and will stall out. So we react very slowly in the United States, and we tend to overreact. And we tend to not see some of the weaknesses and the setbacks that have been experienced by people we perceived as competition or even an enemy. So I think she more likely is pulling back in some areas, making a final test in some other areas to see what's going on. I think he's overextended. I think he's burned up a fair amount of goodwill for China, and it will take China a lot of effort to get that back. One final thing. You'll recall that even though the United States didn't have a tremendous interest in Africa, China suddenly did in the 1980s and 90s and began building a presence there, both official and private, and the US took a lot of notice. As a result of this buildup in Africa, China got a lot of positive positioning, if you want, a lot of good points. But then lately, because of anti-African behavior by Chinese civilians in China, African nations are now complaining about Chinese behavior. And the end result of that is that China's cause in Africa has suffered a mighty setback. That will be very, very difficult to offset. And China's economy has also slowed. And as a result of that, the wherewithal to move internationally and to basically, with money, smooth over problems is somewhat diminished. So I think we have to be very careful not just to see China as some omniscient, all-powerful, highly aggressive enemy without any weaknesses, without any limits, and always right, always correct in the strategies that it picks out. I tend to look at this as a point where China has probably reached.
Someone in Beijing didn't like what you said.
China has reached the limits of what it can do now without getting further fouled up. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thanks. I'll let you get your phone. Manuel, let me ask you a question that's come in from one of our audience members, Pablo Menendez. It isn't quite a legal question, but I think it could have a legal component to it. He says, companies such as Nike and Volkswagen make business with China on supplies made from Uighur labor camps. Do you think big companies should change their business practice with China considering their human rights violations? And let me add the legal angle to that. Should Congress and other parliaments take measures to try to impede business that would involve any products as a result of, if you will, slave labor?
Well, it's a very important question that does have legal implications, and it reveals the importance of multinational corporations, of the business sector, in the making of a world order, of international law as well. It is well known, and this is not only something that affects China, it affects a number of countries, including some countries that are closer to us here in Florida, a number of Latin American and Caribbean jurisdictions that are basically attractive to multinational corporations as manufacturing centers, call centers, distribution centers, and so on and so forth, for a variety of reasons. Number one, because the protection of labor or fundamental labor standards and other human rights is very low. Governments are also in a so-called race to the bottom sometimes to compete for attention of international or multinational companies, big manufacturers, not only the ones that you mentioned. So there is an active role both that you can see from companies in trying to bring up some international standard. Of course, this started happening because most companies wanted to do it that way, but because they realized that it was better for business if some standards were in place. Also because the foreign investor is not necessarily an evil actor. The foreign investor wants to do business, get a return, and go and continue doing business with stability. So there are actually interesting examples of commitment by manufacturers. For example, there are agreements that have been entered into the well-known one is the Bangladesh Accords that was created in the aftermath of a horrible accident that happened in Bangladesh involving textile manufacturers. But the Bangladesh Accord basically created a set of standards that would govern manufacturers, workers, unions, and so on and so forth. Most European manufacturers actually became parties to the Bangladesh Accords. Not necessarily American companies for different reasons. This is not obviously to the question that you bring up about China, but the general point being that there is the world is much better today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We are seeing an increased amount of action from the private sector in bringing up standards. Also because the private sector is subject sometimes to the jurisdiction of courts. And this brings me to American companies. They're subject to the jurisdiction of American courts for violations to international law committed abroad. There is a whole set of laws in the United States that allow, under certain circumstances, for the prosecution or the filing of cases against companies that commit illegal acts abroad. In terms of your common question, Dave, about should Congress do something, there are actually laws that provide for some protections to that effect. Some of the trade provisions, bilateral investment treaties sometimes have provisions on the respect for international labor standards. The Department of Labor of the United States has also a monitoring or performs or carries out a monitoring role on the compliance with labor standards, which also affects the status that the United States gives to foreign countries. That's a law in the book. In action may be different. And just to end, there also at the state level, there are some legislative actions. For example, California has a law that was passed in 2012 that basically monitored the source of products sold in the state of California, just to make sure that the manufacturers were in compliance with the protection of human rights, labor standards, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you. The next question is, I'm going to start with Chris, but I think Tom, if you want to touch on it as well, that would be great. Again, this one came in before, and it's about the national security law, indicating that China is attempting, and you touched on this, Chris, and Manuel did too, is attempting to silence communities and critics outside of their territory with the threat of arrest upon return or visitation to China. What effect do you think this will have for those engaging with China, both in academic research, possible self-censorship, and in business for fear of limited access? And then it asks about any FIU-specific impact on this. So Chris, let me start with you.
I think what I would stress is that even before the adoption of this law, the authorities in Beijing were pursuing actions and behaving in a similar way. For example, it's what's widely understood to be the kidnapping of booksellers outside of the PRC who were brought back in from other countries. For example, this extraterritorial effort to censor, that's among the more egregious examples, but I think it falls into the wider category of reshaping incentives and behavior externally. So for example, that major sports clubs in the US or elsewhere don't touch on certain issues, whether it's even raising Hong Kong freedom on the agenda as an executive at the Houston Rockets did, and received massive attacks online and all sorts of other commercial intimidation. We've seen this replay through hotel chains, through major airlines, through world-class automobile companies, all of whom have been exhorted by the Chinese authorities and intimidated to curb their speech. So this is all predating the Hong Kong law. I think what we're seeing now is another step. We have the formal subjugation of the people within the jurisdiction of Hong Kong, removing its autonomy undoubtedly to impose censorship and remove any forms of accountability there. I think we should take very seriously the signals being sent by Beijing. Companies certainly will have to take it seriously. I'll just say a word about how I think we collectively in open societies should respond, because we've had enough notice in advance of this, and that is we need far stronger collective action. We need far stronger solidarity. We need solidarity at the state level among the democracies. That's been not in sufficient supply so far, but I think as importantly, we need more solidarity among universities. FIU on its own, like any individual university, will really be in a weak position to try to take on the CCP, whether it's through a commercial enterprise or whether it's through the Confucius Institutes, which are operating through Hanban, or have been until recently, which is a state propaganda organ within the Chinese party state. I think doing that on one's own is extremely difficult. Were that to be done among a consortium or a group of universities who have a set of standards, just to use that example, far easier to fight a battle, still going to be difficult. Likewise for media outlets or for publishers who are under enormous stress now in this space. If any single entity tries to do that on its own, it's going to be a very, very difficult struggle. If they're able to operate with some community standards, some meaningful degree of solidarity and collective action, far easier to fight this battle, not only in the case of China, which is admittedly an incredibly powerful and large actor in political, diplomatic, and economic terms, but for other such countries that operate beyond the rule of law and are increasingly in an era of globalization, seeking to exert and impose their preferences on free societies. I think this is something we've yet to fully come to grips with, but we need to do that very quickly.
Tom, do you want to add anything from the academic research perspective?
Oh, sure. First of all, the Association for Asian Studies, which has 6,500 members around the world, has already issued a bulletin to all its membership raising this as a major concern. So I expect that that association, which is the prime association in the United States for Asian studies, will continue to pursue this matter. So I agree with Christopher, this is something that has to be done en masse. I think that this is an extraordinarily stupid move by the Chinese government, because one of the things that helped the reconciliation, if you want, between the United States and China was the goodwill that was generated by perhaps naive young sinologists back in the 70s, 60s and 70s that sort of greased the way for, and helped Nixon and his campaign to open relations with China. This is throwing salt into the well, basically. It's going to turn people away from the study of China. It's going to deprive our country of any but, let's say, career military from studying China seriously over the long term. So in terms of gaining goodwill for the long term, this is not smart politics by the Chinese government. Everywhere you look now, you can see that Xi Jinping, who models himself on Mao Zedong to a certain extent, is building bad will toward China and eroding the soft power that China basically built up over decades of investment, of quasi-openness. But China isn't doing anything abroad that it hasn't been doing for some time at home. For the last at least 10 years or so, or maybe 8 years, China's been squishing its own academics and restricting academic freedom at home. There's usually, from my point of view at any rate, very little distinction between what happens at home and what a country does abroad. They tend to be sort of complementary or of the same cloth. And I think what China has done to its own academic structure, it's now trying to do to other countries abroad. So as Christopher said, this shouldn't be a surprise, right? This has been going on for some time. One last thing, this isn't just universities. If you look at the Wall Street Journal for the 20th of the month, Hong Kong teachers feel Beijing's reach. And there's a discussion there about how elementary and secondary school teachers, particularly secondary school teachers, have been fired or disciplined for supporting the demonstrators, even doing so privately on their own personal communications. So I'm not sure if the Chinese government is subtle enough, right, to basically not hurt its own interests by what it's trying to do.
Unfortunately, we only have about a little over 5 minutes left. This has gone very fast. And I have quite a few questions, so I'm not going to do justice to the people who have sent them in. My apologies in advance. Let me ask a question, maybe Chris, I'll direct this one to you, because I think there is concern out there people have. Could things between, say, China and the United States really rev up? Could we go from, whether you agree with the term Cold War or not to describe relations right now, could things spin out of control into some sort of military confrontation, particularly with free passage and the South China Sea channels and those kinds of things?
So David, I'm not sure I'm the best equipped to respond to the military aspect of the question. I think in a way, part of this is, and it comes back to something Professor Breslin said, is how the leadership in China sees its interests and what it's pursuing beyond its borders. Is it really pursuing goodwill in the way we see that from an open society perspective? I think a lot of the evidence suggests, and there've been some terrific writing by any number of people on this subject, that a good deal of this is to prevent challenges or any contestation of the Chinese Communist Party itself. And if that's the case, it should lead us to some different conclusions about the way it's operating beyond its borders, especially in the idea space, in the non-kinetic space, which I would emphasize. And this is, I think, where many observers in open societies have been slow to at least engage in a discussion about that possibility, because there's so much evidence that's come before us through a host of reports that have been produced by incredibly well-informed experts just in the last 2 or 3 years, including by Larry Diamond and Orville Schell, their report that was released 2 years ago, but many others, that suggests that the ambitions of the leadership in China, which itself brooks no dissent and permits no opposition, may not be to engender goodwill overseas, but to get others to bend to its will. And I think this is something that we need to reflect on.
If I can, Manuel, let me ask you a question that's come in about the repression, the terrible repression of the Uyghurs. Are there any legal obligations or responsibilities of the international community to do something about this? We're talking somewhere on the order between 1 and 3 million, possibly.
Yeah, so you know, I want to bring us back to something that I said earlier in passing, the difference between the law in the books and the law in action. Interestingly, China, being the superpower that it is, has, at least in appearance, become part of the international human rights legal framework. Unlike the United States, China has entered into a number of treaties, has been an observer of other organizations, has not used its Security Council veto power to attack some of the institutions that are, you know, seen as institutions that protect human rights, but yet in practice does what it does. So it's an extremely complicated situation because the laws are there. As I said earlier, the Hong Kong security law has provisions. You know, it starts off, when you read the law, it reads like the law of any modern country that is basically trying to put some order in chaos. It talks about the protection for human rights, the autonomy, the respect for treaties, including, as I said, you know, some important foundational UN treaties, but on the other hand, doesn't follow them. You know, there is persecution, there is this looming authority, imposition of lifetime sentences, and so on and so forth. So it's very complicated, and the world, you know, the hands are tied. Also because some of the other countries that could perhaps, you know, serve as counterbalance to China don't have a pristine record either. So it's doing this in a situation where it can. Unfortunately, there will be pressure. There is a great loss, you know, the comments about the loss to academic institutions and intellectual life are certain. The loss to business opportunity and so on and so forth are significant as well.
Great. Talia, who's a student of mine, if you email me the question for Chris, I promise you I will get that question to him, and I promise you I will get an answer from him on your question. So forgive me for not asking it now. I'm going to pose the last question to Tom. It comes from Alejandro, who says, as part of China's partial abandonment of its goodwill or its win-win diplomacy with recent conflicts with India and the forceful tightening of Hong Kong, could we possibly see an increase in tension and control in the South China Sea to entrap or block Taiwan, which hasn't come up much in our discussion?
Right. There's always a possibility for the increase in tension, but it's very, very important for the United States in particular to very coolly assess what its real interests are, given the security dilemma that China is enmeshed in as its neighbors around the South China Sea and the East China Sea, for that matter, build up their militaries in response to China. So that remains to play out, but I think we really need to think through at our level and not be trapped by some sort of nationalistic reaction on our part. We have to really be cool-headed.
Great. I'm afraid, again, with apologies to the others who sent in questions, that we weren't able to get to them in the interest of time. But I really want to thank Tom Breslin, Manuel Gomez, Chris Walker for a terrific discussion, very informative. The hour went very quickly, always a good sign of how these webinars go. So sincere thanks to you for taking the time to join us today. Also want to thank the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series for sponsoring today's discussion. I'm David Kramer with the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs here at Florida International University in Miami. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and look forward to welcoming you on our next webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.